Hello, my name is Elizabeth Rard, and I'm here to talk to you today about Gettier cases. So Edmund Gettier published a very short paper in 1963 in which he gave two cases that were meant to serve as counterexamples to the then dominant account of the concept of knowledge. So his paper was hugely influential in traditional epistemology. Now, we're going to look at one of his counterexamples, one of his cases in detail. But before we do that, we need to get clear on the position that he's responding to so we can understand how he goes about attacking this position. So at the time, the accepted account of knowledge was a three-part account of knowledge. The account said that if you have a person or a subject S, then you can say that they know a proposition P if they meet three conditions. The first condition is that they actually believe the proposition. The second condition is that the proposition they believe is true. And the third condition is that they have justification for believing the proposition. So our three-part analysis, that is the target of Gettier's counterexample, is going to be that knowledge is justified, true belief. Okay, so if you have justification plus truth plus belief in a proposition, then you have knowledge of that proposition. Okay, good. The first two conditions are relatively uncontroversial. So belief and truth, there doesn't seem to be much trouble there. But what about this third condition, justification? The reason we need a third condition is because just having a true belief is not sufficient for us to have knowledge. So for example, we can imagine a woman who lives in a room that has no windows and no doors, and so she never leaves the room. And she has no idea what's going on outside. Yet every morning when she wakes up, she forms a belief in her head that it's raining outside. So in her head, she imagines that it's raining. Okay? And maybe she imagines this because she's sad and the rain makes her think of being sad or something, and so she associates them. But the idea here is she doesn't have really good reason for believing this. Now, most days, it's going to turn out to be the case that it's actually sunny outside, so her belief will be false. But every once in a while, it's actually going to be raining outside. And so she's got a belief, and that belief is true because it happens to be raining. Now, we don't want to say that in this case, Petunia is in possession of knowledge. She doesn't know that it's raining outside, even though she happens to have a true belief. And it seems like this is because her belief in the proposition that it's raining outside is sort of accidentally true. She just sort of happened to get it right that day. And so in order to avoid cases like Petunia ending up being cases of knowledge, we have to add some third thing in, and traditionally that thing has been justification. So what do we mean by justification? What does it mean for our beliefs to be justified? There are a lot of accounts of this, and normally it's going to have something to do with forming your belief in the right way, or having the right sort of evidence or the right amount of evidence. But for our purposes, we can say that having a justified belief just means that you've got good reasons for your belief. Okay, and we won't worry too much about the details of that right now. All right, so we've got a justified true belief account of knowledge, and Gettier wants to attack this. Now, before we look at the details of how he goes about doing this, let's stop for a minute to consider what kinds of conditions we have here. Now, there are two main kinds of conditions. There are what are called necessary conditions and what are called sufficient conditions. If something is a necessary condition, so for instance, if A is a necessary condition for outcome B, that means that in order to get outcome B, you're going to have to meet condition A. So an example of this might be a necessary condition for getting into a university. In order to get into a university, it has to be the case that you've applied to the university. Unfortunately, they don't just call you up and invite you. You have to apply. So a necessary condition for being admitted to university is submitting an application. We can also look at sufficient conditions. So if something is a sufficient condition, so for example, if A is a sufficient condition for outcome B, then A's being true is enough to guarantee that B will be true. So we might think about different ways to cook a potato. So for instance, if I want to cook a potato, it's sufficient for me to boil it in a pot of water for a certain amount of time, like, I don't know, 20 minutes or so. So boiling a potato with the right amount of water for the right amount of time is sufficient to cook the potato. If I do the boiling, I get a guaranteed cooked potato. Now, one thing to notice is that I don't have to boil my potato in order to cook it. I've got other options. So for instance, I could try cubing my potato and then frying it. Or I could try baking it in the oven for an hour and a half wrapped in foil. So there are other ways to cook the potato. So even though boiling a potato is sufficient to achieve the outcome of a cooked potato, it's not necessary. I don't have to boil my potato in order to get a cooked potato. Okay, good. Another thing to notice, if you think back to our case of applying to colleges or universities, is that while submitting an application is necessary for being accepted into university, unfortunately it's not sufficient. So you probably have to meet a few other conditions, such as having a specific GPA, or having taken the right transferable classes, or having an excellent writing sample. So just submitting an application, while necessary to get into university, is not sufficient to get into university. Okay, so we can have conditions that are necessary, we can have conditions that are sufficient. We can also have conditions that are both necessary and sufficient. So an example of a condition that would be necessary and sufficient might be the condition for getting a perfect score on an exam. It's both necessary and sufficient to get a perfect score on an exam that you answer every single question correctly. So if I answer all the questions correctly, I'm guaranteed to get a perfect score. So that makes answering all the questions sufficient to get a perfect score. In addition, if I don't answer them all correctly, I can't get a perfect score. That makes this a necessary condition. All right, there's one more type of relationship between conditions that we need to consider, and that is what is called jointly sufficient conditions. So sometimes conditions are jointly sufficient. Okay, when we have jointly sufficient conditions, we have a set of conditions that when taken together give us a sufficient condition. So we might have a list of conditions or a group of conditions that when they're all met all at the same time, it guarantees the outcome that we're after. So we might think of the conditions for passing a philosophy class. So imagine you're taking this philosophy class and you reason, well, if I get an A on the midterm and I get an A on the final and I get an A on the paper, that will guarantee that I pass the class. So achieving those three conditions, meeting those three goals, getting an A on the midterm, an A on the final, and an A on the paper, are jointly sufficient for passing the class. Okay? If you only do two of them, you're not sure if you're going to pass, but if you do all three, then you know for sure that you will pass, so they're jointly sufficient. Okay, good. How does that relate to our traditional account of knowledge? Well, to begin with, we know that each of these conditions is necessary. So for instance, in order to have knowledge that P, it must be the case that I actually believe the proposition P. So belief in P is necessary for knowledge. Likewise, in order to know P, it must be the case that P is true. So P being true is a necessary condition for knowledge of P. Lastly, in order to know P, I have to be justified in my belief, as we saw from our Petunia case. Okay, good. So these are all individually necessary conditions. But that's not really what Gettier wants to pick at. In addition to each being necessary, the justified true belief account of knowledge says that taken together, these give us a set of jointly sufficient conditions. So these guys are jointly sufficient. So what does that mean? Well, that means that every time we get all three of these together, every time I have a justified true belief that P, I'm guaranteed to have knowledge that P. Okay, so this is what Gettier is going to do. He's going to give us a case. He gives two, but we'll talk about only one of them. He's going to give us a case where we have a subject who has a justified true belief in a proposition, yet does not have knowledge of the proposition. So imagine again that you said to me, well, getting an A on the midterm and on the final and on the writing assignment is jointly sufficient for passing in the class. And I said, well, hang on a minute. You could still fail the class even if you met all three of those conditions. if you were, for instance, caught cheating. So what I've done here is I've given a counterexample. I've shown a case where you meet all three of the supposedly jointly sufficient conditions, yet you don't get the outcome for some reason. And so this shows that those conditions can't actually be jointly sufficient. This is exactly what Gettier is going to do. So Gettier says, imagine that we've got two people. One's name is Smith, the other is Jones. And Smith and Jones have just interviewed for a job, and now they're sitting in a room waiting to find out who got the job. And for some reason, to break the tension, Jones decides to count all of the coins in his pocket. And he does it out loud, and he does it in front of Smith, so they both come to learn together that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Okay, so Jones, for whatever reason, counts his coins. He's like, okay, I've got 10 coins. He puts them back in his pocket. And then a little while later, the president of the company comes in and congratulates Jones on his wonderful interview. She says, oh, you gave a fantastic interview. We love your application materials. We can't wait to work for you. Or work with you, rather. Sorry. And so Smith gets kind of sad. You know, he's happy for Jones, but he's sort of disappointed. And he heads out to the parking lot with a belief that Jones is going to get the job. Now, he's heading for the bus. And while he's doing this, he's sort of putting together different propositions in his head that he believes for, for entertainment purposes, let's say. One proposition that Jones now believes is the proposition that Smith now believes is that Jones, who has 10 coins in his pocket, will get the job. Another proposition that Smith forms as a belief is a belief that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket. So we can take a peek in Smith's head, and he believes proposition P. The person who gets the job has 10 coins. Okay, so here we have our case. So here's the case. Smith believes proposition P, and the proposition is that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket. All right, now we know this is a belief because we can see it here in Smith's head. So Smith believes this. In addition, Smith is justified in believing this. Why? Well, because Smith is justified in believing that Jones will get the job. Smith has good reason to think Jones will get the job. In addition, Smith has good reason to think that Jones has 10 coins in his pocket. Now, what makes this case interesting is that it actually turns out that the proposition is true, just not in the way that Smith thinks it is. So it actually turns out that for some reason, the president changes their mind and decides to hire Smith instead. So Smith is the person who gets the job. Maybe she missed something in the application the first time and she realized he had some experience that just made him an irresistible candidate. So she decided to change her mind. In addition, what Smith doesn't realize is that Smith also has 10 coins in his pocket. He just didn't bother to count, but it just turned out that he's got 10 coins. So what we have here is Smith believing a proposition P. The proposition is that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket. Smith believes this. Smith is justified in believing this. And in addition, the proposition happened to turn out to be true. So we've met all three of what we're told are jointly sufficient conditions for knowledge. However, we don't want to say that Smith has knowledge here. It seems very odd to say that Smith knows that the person who gets the job has 10 coins in their pocket. So we want to say that we don't have knowledge in this case. Why do we want to not say that Smith has knowledge? Well, it seems very relevant that Smith doesn't actually know who's getting the job. Smith falsely believes that Jones is getting the job, and this belief rests on that false belief. Likewise, Smith has no idea that he himself has 10 coins in his pocket. So what Gettier has done here is he has given a case where someone meets all three of these conditions. They have a justified true belief in a proposition, which the justified true belief account of knowledge says is all you need to have knowledge. Yet in this particular case, we want to say that Smith does not have knowledge. So this is a counterexample. It says, look, we have all three of your supposedly jointly sufficient conditions. We don't have knowledge, therefore they can't actually be jointly sufficient. All right, thank you so much.